Okay, we should now be live. Just gonna double check.
All right. Pretty sure that we can say One Piece is a seinen now.
All right. Hey, RC Baron, thanks for stopping by. Yeah, the Kuma flashback is pretty dark. Yeah. Okay, so today I am joined by Big Dad. If you're somehow not familiar, Big Dad also makes One Piece content here on YouTube. I highly recommend you check out his channel. There should be a link in the description, but if not, I will put one in the chat in a minute here. Today we are going to be talking about flashbacks, not just in One Piece, but also in fiction in general. But then we are going to obviously move into One Piece, because of course this is a One Piece channel, and One Piece is, for many things it's well known for, but of course it's well known for flashbacks and the emotions within the flashbacks. So we're going to talk about how One Piece manages to differentiate itself and how it sort of specializes in the art of flashbacks. And then we're going to move into talking about some of our specific favorite flashbacks and the highlights within those that make them so memorable. Big Dad, if you want to get the ball rolling, what, in general, when you think of flashbacks or satisfying flashbacks versus just a flashback that maybe exists for novelty, what do you think separates the two?
Well, I think in other stories and stuff, sometimes flashbacks can be a little bit of like a character development crutch that you go back and you kind of like fill in stuff that's been left out. And I think what One Piece does differently, like whenever you go to a flashback in One Piece, you are generally the person who is related to the flashback, who the flashback is for in terms of the story. Like for right now in the anime, we have Bonnie essentially kind of like at this do or die moment of her life, and she's essentially recalling the memories that she felt and experienced from Kuma in the kind of like Vegapunk Kuma brain memory storage. So I think that the way that he does it, it feels very like natural and not like kind of randomly inserted in most of the time, because he has a lot of um he's just very deliberate with when he implements a flashback. And while I think when we're reading it we're like, we want the flashback now, he makes sure he finds the right time in the story to put it in. And then a lot of the times the flashbacks are really, they're like some of the only times that One Piece consistently deals with death, right?
Yeah.
And death is like this human condition that we all ultimately face one day. And as much as we spend most of our time kind of trying to avoid it or seeking something else, one day it's coming. And like our greatest fear is to have a purposeless death, but a lot of these flashbacks show a death, but with a kind of an insane degree of purpose, so much so that whoever's recalling the flashback usually is left with the determination to keep living by the end of that kind of like story that they're remembering in this penultimate moment.
Yeah. So, would you say that timing of when the flashback comes into the narrative influences how it's received?
Yeah, for sure, because it's kind of this release of tension usually from this moment. Like, in my mind, a lot of the flashbacks come at this very intense moment, and the flashback kind of, it's just like this tonal change to kind of ramp into it rather than just kind of randomly fitting into the story. And then when you cut back into the story, you are kind of thrown back into that intense moment, but you now have, you kind of now know what to do. Like through the character, you know what to do. You know what they should do. And when they make their decision of how to live, to be purposeful in what they do, whether they're usually choosing to try to live, we now fully understand where that decision comes from, rather than just kind of being just entertained purely, I guess, by just getting it whenever.
Yeah. I think another thing for me, that one of the reasons why I love One Piece flashbacks in general, but they're not the only story to do this well, and that's just how flashbacks can alter your perception and how they give you new context. So I think that for me, the defining feature of a good flashback is one that completely recontextualizes your understanding of a character. So because One Piece, sometimes a lot of people will say that One Piece flashbacks are all the same because all the characters just have something sad happen to them. And I don't think that's the case, because each flashback feels unique to that character in how it actually characterizes who they are and how they developed. Because with any character, you could go back and just show sad, experiences of suffering that they went through, but it takes really good writing to be able to use that in a way that alters your perception of who they are in the present. And I think One Piece does that especially well.
You know what's interesting is I'm constantly, well, nearly constantly rereading One Piece, or maybe rewatching a section.
Yeah.
And the most recent arc that I reread was Whole Cake Island, and in that arc you get a couple major flashbacks. I would say you get Sanji's flashback and you get Big Mom's flashback. And I recorded a video for this and stuff, so I'll give you guys a little taste. But I found Big Mom's flashback very interesting because I don't like Big Mom. I don't really empathize with her. Mm-hmm. But when I read her flashback again, I couldn't help but see the humanity in Lin Lin, right? And so while I don't empathize with her, I understand who she is as a person because of what you learn in her flashback. And it that's a level of nuance where I don't feel like Oda was trying to make me empathize with
Yeah.
Big Mom, but he did want me to walk away understanding who she is because her backstory is kind of critical in terms of understanding her, but also in terms of understanding why she is the way she is, how and why she's different from Sanji, even though they have kind of similar um, upbringings, but they were used and or discarded for like different reasons. Um, and so like you could take a lot of these flashbacks and kind of compare them to other characters, and there's often kind of like an interesting like inversion on how these characters walk away from their past and move forward in life based off of what happened in their past and how we've seen other characters go through similar things.
Yeah, and with Big Mom and characters like her, learning of who she was and what she went through allows it, like, it informs us about why things like why her empire is the way that it is, why
Mhm.
there's this focus on getting all these races together, and just little things like that. I think another good example is Doflamingo, who
Yeah.
is arguably worse than Big Mom as a person. Um, I mean, you could at least with Big Mom, you could argue that she's mentally still a child in a lot of ways, but Doflamingo is just fully intentionally evil. But
Hmm.
that's another character where you go to his flashback, and by the end of it, when you come out, you understand exactly like why he is the way that he is, and to be able to do that with a character as despicable like that, and also like with characters like you said with Big Mom, but to not feel like you're being forced to empathize with them, because sometimes that can happen too. The author can kind of be pushing a certain framing of the character that feels like they're trying to make you feel bad for them, or they're trying to make you like them. But
Yeah.
Oda, I think he does that really well with everything in the story. He doesn't necessarily try to make you feel or think any sort of way. I mean, with the emotional storytelling, he's very exact and precise with getting certain
Hmm.
emotional reactions out of you. But in general, with the more philosophical and broader topics, he kind of just places them and then lets you think whatever you want to think about them.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like even with like you were saying with Doflamingo, I mean, when you get pieces of him, like I remember there's like a panel with him like waking up and he's like sweating and like he was having like a nightmare. And so then given what you see in his flashback and the kind of like juxtaposition between some of these scenes and the flashback, you really understand that he's like a deeply alienated person, right? Who's really suffered greatly, and he's trying to like relieve himself of some of this pain and stuff, but he's seeking it in a very like self-destructive path. Of course, we see come to an end. You know, um, he ends up being destroyed, and everything he built is destroyed. And it'd be interesting too to see if we see him ever come back in the story to see if he um, just kind of keeps going down the same road. You would hope that you get your ass beat that bad, you would maybe reflect a little bit and be like, hey, maybe I was wrong about things.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks that Doflamingo is he just is who he is at this point. But I mean, we know that his father, I mean, it's more than just his nature. His father was a good person, at least in spirit, and we've seen that Oda is willing to show celestial dragons in a morally gray area, like with what was his name? Mjosgard. He was
Yeah.
somebody who actually changed. So it would. I've always wondered because I can't even picture what Oda would want to do with Doflamingo at this point. So I just don't know how he would handle something like that.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, I think he'd have to figure out what he wants to do in this new world because, I mean, he's never going to be at the top of it for sure.
Yeah.
And he's not going to be able to end the world or whatever he wanted to do. I mean, he basically was on a path of revenge, right? And that, as we kind of like know from real life and other stories, that the typical like use of revenge is that it leads to your own annihilation.
Yeah.
And I mean, like like in terms of like just personality, without like the messed up stuff Doflamingo has done, Luffy's like, hey, you're kind of like, you like look weird and you're kind of like interesting. I don't know. You know, he didn't come into Doflamingo with exactly like preconceived notions of him being evil.
Yeah.
But I mean, it also kind of just raises a question of these people that were doing horrible shit, and now they're forced to kind of keep existing. You know, they haven't died; they still have a chance for a purposeful death down the line. They do have a chance to change and become better, and we have like there's a lot of people in the story besides just the worst of the worst that are going to kind of also have to kind of reckon with that, like a large swaths of the Navy, people that are involved in the world government, who knows, with just like the general like average celestial dragon. Like you can't just, I don't think anybody, we don't need flashbacks for all of them and stuff, but like I think the flashbacks have really shown that how the past affects people, and then how you can kind of move past that. And a lot of times we get very liberating viewpoints where we see somebody push through in a positive way. But it'd be curious to see with some of these characters, once they're destroyed, or like whatever they built up is destroyed, what they're going to do next. Because they still often did, like Big Mom still remembered her past, the portions that she can remember. And she kind of went straight from that rampage on Whole Cake Island straight over to Wano. If she ends up living, I'm like, what is she going to do now? I have no idea. But it'd be interesting to see if she is alive.
Yeah. It's very, very interesting the place that a lot of these past villains are now in. But as far as flashbacks with them, I think that we've kind of established how Oda manages to sort of perfect his flashbacks, if you will, through recontextualizing them, getting the timing down right, of knowing exactly when the audience needs to see it, and using that in a way to sort of push the narrative forward and just give more signposts of like where the characters need to go next and what we should be anticipating. But off the top of your head, can you think of any examples of flashbacks, maybe not that like bad flashbacks, but flashbacks that maybe left you wanting more or left you feeling unsatisfied, not necessarily just within One Piece, but in general?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I feel like I see it quite a bit in stories. It's hard to like pinpoint an exact one, but a lot of the times I will say that it feels like I just dip my toes in and I don't feel anything major about why I was shown the flashback. Like for example, like I've been reading like Blue Box, which is a sports romance manga for a while now, and it's pretty far into the story. And occasionally it shows a flashback, just to when they were younger, and it just like it'll be like a half a chapter to just show like that he just barely remembers something, which is like showing why he's doing something in the first place. And for the most part, I'm like, oh, it's kind of interesting seeing some cuteness in here, but I'm also like, I can't help but like consider like One Piece and how it often does more minor flashbacks where Oda will just cut to a flashback for like half a page, and it's almost kind of like teasing this bigger thing down the road. And I guess what I'm getting to is that I think the problem with flashbacks that don't work is usually that they don't build up to that like tension enough to like justify going back and exploring their kind of like subconscious, right?
Yeah.
I also kind of remember I don't want to spoil people that haven't read the Spy Family manga, but there's some flashbacks in the Spy Family manga that I'm like, I just don't even. It's just like kind of randomly thrown in there, and I end up feeling pretty close to nothing about it. Yeah, and then I think one of my problem I have with like movies and stuff sometimes is they'll start out in this kind of like high action intense moment, like just right at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
It's common in like a Mission Impossible or something, and then it'll cut all the way back to the beginning of the movie, and I just think that's a crutch in general, just to like try to keep people's attention or something.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, okay, that was cool. I feel like kind of are like, okay, we'll get to the best part later, and I'm like, not a big fan of that. And it's a similar thing. It doesn't build up to that tension that gets released when you go back to the flashback, and then gets reintroduced, but in a way that you're like much more like comfortable now. Do you have any flashbacks in media or One Piece that you remember that left you wanting?
I remember, well, I mean, you described, I think, what I would also consider to be an unsatisfying flashback pretty well, and I feel like I felt that a lot within Naruto. I mean, there are a lot of things I do like about Naruto.
Yeah,
And
me
there
too.
are a handful of flashbacks I love. For example, with everything with his parents, with Minato, I think was fantastic. I liked Gaara's a lot, but I just remember there were so many of them that just felt like they didn't add much
Yeah,
to the story, and it felt like I was saying earlier, like they were kind of just trying to make you feel emotional without really saying anything about the individual character and why they are the way they are. I'm trying to think of some others, because the ones that I don't enjoy just aren't memorable to me, I guess.
have you ever read or watched, but mainly read, Berserk?
No, I haven't read Berserk.
Okay, so Berserk probably has so Berserk, if you read it, right, you
Yeah.
read the first 3 volumes, and you see Guts, and he's just being a dick. He's just an asshole, and he's like, there's like demons and stuff chasing him, and he's just an asshole, and he's kind of like an edgelord or something. um, and then and that's the first 3 volumes of Berserk. It's good, but you're just kind of like thrown into this guy. You don't really know what's his problem. And when Kentaro Miura decided to really taking his story very seriously, because he had the opportunity to be involved in what would be a very successful commercial manga, partnering with like another guy, where the other guy would do the story and then Kentaro Miura would do the art. It was like, no, I think I have something here. And so when he gets to volume 4, he takes the story into a very different direction, where he goes back from, Guts during the first 3 volumes is maybe like 20-ish, and they cut back to literally his birth. And then the next, like, I don't know, 6 to 9 volumes are just called the Golden Era, and that's all of Guts' life leading up to the first 3 volumes. And a lot of people who've only seen like the anime and stuff, they love the Golden Age part of the story because it's extremely well done and it's extremely emotional, and it's extremely and he wasn't like really planning this when he first started those first 3 volumes, but the way he comes back and connects it to those kind of early volumes of the story, it's masterful. It's masterful, and I think that's probably one of the greatest uses of a flashback I've seen, especially when he is able to wrap around and just connect everything so beautifully. If you haven't read Berserk, if you could handle some really messed up content, please read Berserk. It is honestly as beautiful and good as One Piece, and probably more painful, unfortunately, but yeah.
Interesting. I think one example of a flashback that I wasn't super crazy about, at least at first, well, not just one specific flashback, but I wasn't initially sure how I felt about the way that flashbacks were done in JoJo's.
Mm,
Because
that's an interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting one.
there's very different than One Piece, and I think because I have very specific expectations for flashbacks because of One Piece.
Hmm.
But I will say that I've grown to love pretty much every flashback that I have seen. I felt like one that I felt it could have had a little bit more was maybe Josuke's. I
Yeah.
liked, I don't know, I just felt like there was more that could have been said about his character other than how or why he has his hairstyle and why he feels so strongly about it. I liked what we had, but I felt like we could have gone further. But then on the other
Yeah.
side of it, you have characters like Kakyoin, Polnareff. Polnareff doesn't really have a flashback, but he has a background that we learn about.
Hmm.
And then most recently I saw Giorno's, and Giorno's I really liked. That one's probably my
Hmm.
favorite. But both Giorno's and Kakyoin's are really, really short, and
Yep.
maybe it's because it's faster paced in the anime, but they kind of just happen pretty quickly. They don't even take up a full episode. Kakyoin's is, I think, less than 5-10 minutes. But
Oh
at the
yeah, for
same
sure.
time, they take everything that we already know about the character, or everything that's been presented, and they manage to cover all of that, and so it feels well rounded. It feels like we've learned something. And I think that's the key thing, is when you leave a flashback feeling like you've learned something, and then it connects back to the story, like what you said with Berserk. I can't even imagine what was done with that flashback. But being able to bring it all back around, I think is super key. And I think there are different ways to do this, basically my point, because with JoJo's, compared to One Piece, it is, from what I've seen so far, it is much faster paced. Flashbacks aren't really the priority with how he wants to tell the story of his characters. He does it in different ways,
Hmm.
but they do feel necessary most of the time. Kakyoin's does come at that moment of high tension, like you said, when they're
Yeah.
in the middle of the fight. But is Giorno's feels like more like a typical flashback. It just sort of happens right after we meet the character, and that felt very necessary to me, because I felt like at that time I needed to know why I should care about this character. With Kakyoin, I already had that, and that was meant to just sort of deepen the character. But
Yeah.
I think on the surface, JoJo's flashbacks can seem like they don't have a lot of content, but they just
Hmm.
they hit all the right beats is what I'm trying to say, and I feel like that is enough for me there.
Yeah, I definitely feel like Araki is really. I don't know if he might just not personally like think he's better at writing like a more of like a present story,
Yeah,
because you're right. Like when I've read the manga, those flashbacks they're very quick. They're
yeah,
a couple pages at most, almost across the whole series. I think Giorno has probably the longest one that comes to mind immediately. But in general, he does like to keep them very concise. He doesn't like to say, but he also it's very rare too, right?
hmm,
You might
yeah,
get like one or two flashbacks per part of JoJo's, and that's like 150 chapters. Maybe 50 episodes of very fast-paced story. I remember Zappelli's from part one was pretty good too. Is something that I can recall as pretty memorable. When he's thinking about like he actually is his flashback goes back to when he learns of the prophecy of his death, of
oh
where
yeah,
he's gonna have this like very important moment, and he needs to make the right choice, and he literally is like, this is that moment, and he like jumps into action, and then you get the flashback for like 5 minutes maybe, like it's
yeah,
very short, and then it happens and you're like, you know so I'd say that Araki really tries to, he almost just keeps the flashback so concise and short that it kind of just weaves together rather than feeling like this separate thing. And that's part of the reason why it's probably hard to recall exactly where the flashbacks begin and end, because they are very quickly implemented.
yeah. So it all just comes back to like how the author uses the flashback. Why is there a purpose to it? What does it tell us about the character? How does it reflect on the story that came before and what we can expect going forward? And it it doesn't it can, for me, sometimes I do prefer the longer flashbacks. I feel like I like to really just settle into them and really get to know the character and like the little moments, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the One Piece flashbacks, because that is something that Oda does really well. But at the end of the day, it really just comes down to the execution. But as we both said at the beginning of the stream, One Piece is, it's probably most well known for like the big world and the world building and all that. I think
Hmm.
second to that, maybe just the general emotional storytelling. But then like
Yeah.
third is the flashbacks, because within the community, whenever we get a new character, like currently with Loki, everyone immediately starts thinking like, when are we getting the flashback? Because it's almost a guarantee. But with One Piece, um, today we've both picked out some of our favorite flashbacks, for different reasons, of course. We have, for me personally, I can say that I won't be ranking these in any order because that would be a much more difficult stream, I think. Um, but if you'd like to just sort of start that conversation and talk about maybe one of those flashbacks that you've thought about, and kind of walk us through what makes it special for you.
Yeah. So I'll start with Sanji. I'm a
That's a great
I'm a
one.
big fan of Sanji in general. I've only grown to love that guy more the longer I've been reading and loving One Piece. But specifically, I'm going to go with his Whole Cake Island uh, flashback, because, man, Sanji is one lost dude at the first half of Whole Cake Island, right? And when we get his flashback, we see that he's considered a failure by his family from basically birth. He's disowned, um, just treated horribly, except for one person, except for his mom, who, um, even though he was a terrible cook, just trying to learn how to make food because it was this like emerging passion of his, he gladly eats his disgusting food and has a sincere smile on her face, right? And he's recalling these moments, and obviously she dies, but that like love that she gave him stuck with him and made him who he is. And then how all that pain that we see him go through with how he's treated by Judge and within his own family, and the shame that he holds in his own heart about like not being able to meet parental expectations. He eventually is kind of relieved of all of that. He gets to escape, with some help from his sister, and ultimately the permission of Judge in a way. And then we get his life with. Then he goes on the sea. Eventually meets Zeph. We all know how that plays out. But when he gets back into Whole Cake Island and he's thrown back into this family, he gets kind of turned back into that child that's experiencing all this horrible pain. And Luffy is the one that is like begging for him to come back. He's basically saying like, "We love you, Sanji. We can't." He's like, "I literally cannot become king of the pirates without you. I cannot achieve my dream without you." Because that is the reason that Luffy wants to become king of the pirates, is because it's his belief that only by becoming king of the pirates is his dream even possible. So he's telling Sanji like, "My dream, it can never happen without you. I need you." While everybody else is basically has told him his whole life, these people that he's kind of mixed back in with, and obviously the entire Big Mom family is like toxic with each other and with Big Mom, and that whole situation is bad. And Sanji eventually is coming to the realization that he messed up and that he's just going to die with his family, but he has a pathological need to make food for people, something instilled by his mother. And so when he goes and sees Luffy, who claimed that he'd be waiting for him, he can't find Luffy. He's looking for him. He dropped his food that he made for Luffy in the mud. It's objectively disgusting. And then he sees Luffy sitting there, exhausted. And when he sees Sanji, Luffy smiles. And Sanji's fighting the two sides of him, not sure how to feel. And then what really changes Sanji is when Luffy eats that food, which is disgusting again. He does the exact same smile, that just smile of like pure love that his mom gave him when he was just a child. And that is ultimately what breaks Sanji out of this prison that he's found himself in, and allows him to actually seek out what he wants to lead a purposeful life. And yeah, that flashback is amazingly kind of shows why Sanji has done what he's done, and is woven into the story into a perfect loop where his flashback starts with essentially with him giving food to his mom, and then after it ends, the kind of like immediate aftermath in terms of the story is when he picks himself back up, is when Luffy gives him that same love again to remind him of who he really is.
Yeah, that honestly is perfectly said. And I think Sanji, among the Straw Hats, he's pretty unique for having basically that extra flashback and having that post-time skip flashback too. And it very easily could have been like just it very easily could have just been like what we were saying about those like sort of arbitrary flashbacks. And it's one of those reasons why I don't really understand why so many people want other characters to have that same treatment. Like people wanted Zoro to have a big flashback in Wano. Some people have said that maybe Nami will get another flashback, and I feel like maybe some of those people are just kind of missing the point that Sanji's flashback was necessary for that story. and for his story too. Um, it added a lot to his character, and it didn't really feel like it changed anything, despite how much new information we learned. If anything,
Hmm.
it just sort of expanded on what we knew, but it just took things to a deeper level. I personally really liked how it gives the Baratier arc a whole new perspective to view it from,
Yeah.
especially his relationship with Zeph. Zeph and Sanji is probably one of my favorite relationships in One Piece,
Oh yeah.
and it's just so much better after seeing what he went through before meeting him. It just makes the emotion so much more potent.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think that like I guess I see people's point with the other flashbacks, but I mean, in my mind, I'm like, we did get like a little, we did get a little extra flashback with Zoro. In fact, we've gotten little extra. Zoro's flashbacks are very interesting because his flashback with Kuena is very quick as well, and
Hmm.
that's like his main backstory that people pay attention to. But we also get like a little mini flashback during his big fight with Mr. One in Alabasta when he kind of like is reflecting on how to cut steel. You get a little mini flashback, and you get a little mini flashback in Wano when he's um, fighting King and kind of putting his life on the line to try to win. We get a little flashback in there too about kind of I don't know exactly what they're talking about, but a lot of it's about the kind of understanding like a swordsman's sword and stuff, and he's
Yeah.
um, talking as like a little kid. He's talking to the blacksmith on the cliff and stuff. And yeah, it's just interesting how Zoro's flashbacks are kind of like sprinkled in these short little chunks. It works for him.
Yeah, each of the Straw Hats have different needs when it comes to writing. I feel like that is just
Yeah.
enough for Zoro, the type of character that he is, and the way that Oda writes him. Zoro would be more like your average JoJo's character, who you they're
Yeah.
expressed more in the present than they are in the past. And when we do get to see their past, it's just the right amount of information we need in those moments. Um, but I don't know. I as much as I would love to see an extra flashback like that for Zoro, like with what Sanji got, I don't think he needs it as a character. I don't necessarily think that Sanji like wouldn't have been a good character without that flashback, but there was a purpose to Oda bringing it up at that point.
Yeah. And what's your flashback, one of your top fives? Not ordered.
Yeah, so I would probably say Choppers would be the first one I'd want to talk about. I mean, um, Choppers, I think for pre time skip, specifically like pre Alabasta, we get like two or three major flashbacks. One of them is Choppers. The other one I would say Nami. Sanji's is up there, and then Luffy's is pretty memorable too. But that one could also kind of, depending on the person, it might be something that you appreciate more later. But I think Nami, Sanji, Chopper are like the big ones for me in that early part of the story.
Yeah.
We are going to talk about Nami's later, of course, because that you can't really talk about flashbacks in One Piece without talking about that. But I think Chopper's flashback is just so special. First off, it's at that time it was one of the most unusual because you start with this, like with the other ones you're all starting with a character that you can kind of understand where Oda might be going, but with Chopper you're starting with a reindeer that can talk, and it's just a very unusual starting point. Like it's
Hmm.
kind of a glimpse into some of the weirder characters that Oda would give flashbacks for later on, like with Senior Pink, or other members of Doflamingo's crew. But Chopper's just immediately just such a more interesting character. He just immediately created this intrigue in me. Um, and I think it's very cool how Oda takes both the aspect of the humanity within Chopper, and also his more instinctive, animalistic nature, and sort of blends the two. Um, you have the literal side of that where Chopper is actually a reindeer and coming from a family of reindeer that cast him out, for him just sort of being a weak link, which is a very real thing that happens in nature. But then you have the human emotional reaction to that, and you have that desire for people. And I think it's very interesting that as soon as he eats the human fruit, his first instinct, that his first non-animalistic, or it is technically an animal, but his first non-reindeer instinct is to strive for connection, which I think
Hmm.
could arguably be said to be the essence of being human, when you want to compare them to other animals. It's that social connection that drives us and fuels us. And Chopper, going for that, just immediately uh, it immediately humanizes him. But then him being a reindeer, that he has that dichotomy of not being able to fit in with reindeer or animals, not being able to connect with humans. He's just an outcast. Um, and of course, he finds Dr. Hirolook, who is somebody that Chopper didn't need at the time, because Chopper had been attacked by both the reindeer and the humans. What he needed was an actual good doctor, and Dr. Hirolook was far from that. But at the same time, Dr. Hirolook was the only other person that could actually understand Chopper. This very, very specific being that has nowhere to fit in, nowhere to feel like he belongs. Um, this this doctor, who is completely terrible at what he does, and frankly does more harm than good, is the perfect person for this very unique and specific creature with these very specific problems that he only got through like the random acts of chance of just happening to eat a devil fruit. And I think that's really, really beautiful and poetic. Um, and obviously, you have the thematic element there, which is just basically, to put it bluntly, is just it's that love heals, or that love can heal.
Hmm.
And while Dr. Hirolook may not be able to heal Chopper's wounds, he can heal his heart. And I just think that's really beautiful. I think how Oda kind of ties that down with that central theme is very well executed. I think another thing I love about the Drum Island flashback is a little more superficial, but the style of having it all like a almost like a Christmas story or something adjacent to that within the winter vibes. I think that's very cool. Um, and again, once we get back to the present, it informs us of who Chopper is, but it also informs us of why he's fighting, why he belongs with the Straw Hats. It informs us as to why he's with Dr. Kureha. And I think what I love about Chopper's character is how he actually does become a good doctor, unlike Hirolook. Um, through Hirolook's like intense desire to actually heal people, like his love for humanity, essentially, he was able to influence Chopper, this other being, to the point of actually being able to physically heal people. And so, while it is one of those first grand flashbacks, I think it's also one of the first instances of inherited will, or at least explicitly stated inherited will.
Yeah.
I think that's also around the time we actually get the will of D mentioned. So this was Oda kind of, in one sense, it's Oda kind of settling into his comforts as a storyteller and what he wanted to do later on. So you get a lot of that early, a lot of those early One Piece themes that would then be expanded on. You get a very, I think even to this day, a very unique framing for a flashback with Chopper as a character and everything going on in Drum Island, and just the general poetic writing of both Hero Look and Chopper.
Yeah, I think Here Look is such a fascinating character. That dude is hard boiled. On the hard boiled tier list, he's in the S tier.
He's on S tier. Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised because, as you're saying, Chopper was truly suffering when he gained humanity.
Yeah.
And his ability, like, he was just so alienated, right? And as you were saying, we all seek connection and stuff, but he was like a baby. This is like so new to him that he's just completely lost with no guidance. And like you're saying, like, I mean, a medical doctor wouldn't do, like, a good medical doctor wouldn't do Chopper any good because it was like his soul that was suffering, right? And Hero Look is a dog shit kitty doctor for any type of real disease or anything. But in terms of, like, his mission in life was to heal the soul of Drum Kingdom, right? And that's like his whole project of creating the Sakura petals on a winter island, of doing the impossible, implying that, like, dreams that you think are impossible, they are possible. Like, that's part of the reason how we heal the soul. And so it'd be interesting for Chopper, like, he probably, I would suspect, sees Hero Look as a greater doctor than he is currently. And part of Chopper's dream to create a medicine to cure all is not to literally create a medicine that can, like, cure diabetes and cancer or any injury. It's to find something that can heal the soul of everybody in this world of One Piece, because we know how much suffering exists in this world. Right, and as I was kind of talking about things earlier of, like, what some of these people are going to do when they have to reckon with, like, that they've been making the wrong choices and stuff, like, they're going to be suffering as well, and we need something to heal them as well. And I think Chopper could be a part of that once we see the world change in whatever way it's going to change as we approach that kind of end of the story.
Yeah, he wants to do for others what Hero Look did for him.
Yes. Yeah.
And
well,
we can
what was
feel
my
that
next?
within him? Sorry, just want to say, like, we can feel that within him later on in the story with, like, the kids in Punk Hazard and how he acts in Wano. We feel that motivation throughout his actions all the time. Right.
Yeah, he had that. He had a good Wano moment during the raid. I really enjoyed that moment on the reread and in the Punk Hazard as well. But I think because Wano is just a better arc than Punk Hazard in general, I look more fondly on the Wano moment.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Wano, I guess I'll just hop into Odin, because what I really love about Odin's flashback is, like, we're hearing about Odin all the time, like, before Wano, pretty much. I don't remember when he's first mentioned, but we hear about him obviously a lot in Wano, and then when we go into the flashback, we get to meet him and meet this figure that kind of sounded bigger than life, and we see why he had this reputation, and it's just that he was he just stuck out as so differently. The walls of Wano could not hold a person with, like, such, like, massive ambition for adventure. But then what is obviously also amazing about the Odin flashback is, and this is something that's become more common in flashbacks as we approach the end of the story, is Oda wraps in, like, incredibly important world building into some of these flashbacks, right? That we're also not we're not just treated to like this awesome character development and all this kind of stuff, but we also just learn way more about the world that informs us about, I don't know, like every characters, So Odin's flashback is also like a Roger flashback and a Whitebeard flashback, and you're like, okay, this is like amazing. That's how I felt, at least.
Yeah, man. It was the first time I felt like we got a glimpse into what maybe the Void Century flashback could be like. Especially, at
Yeah.
least my interpretation is that Odin could have been Joy Boy. I mean, Kaido kind of
Hmm.
views him that way, but also he's kind of framed that way within the context of the adventure that he goes on. And he always
Hmm.
reminded me so much of Luffy in his
Yep.
spirit and his lust for adventure and just his inability to be contained.
Yeah, I 100% agree that I do think that Odin is framed as a potential Joy Boy. And I find there's that moment, obviously, when the Hour of Legend, I think is what they refer to it all,
Yeah.
when he challenges Kaido, like, hey, if I last an hour, then, like, what do you think of that? And Kaido's like, sure, sounds funny or whatever. And he's just suffers purely out of love for Wano, out of love for the Red Scabbards, that he like literally puts them on his back and takes their pain. It's very reminiscent of Kuma, of Luffy, just like you said, in that same realm as Joy Boy. And when Odin looks death in the face, like they're Kaido's like, history will remember you fondly or whatever, and Odin's like, how about fuck you and I don't care. Like, I was born for this moment. I don't care if people remember me, because like the people that are here right now, they're going to change from this moment that I was born for, which is that I'm gonna boil.
Yeah.
And we see the consequences of that are massive, right? I mean, it changes a young Yamato, obviously. It changes. It's literally like the seeds of the rebellion are planted right there, which happen more than 20 years later.
Yep.
And without Odin's Hour of Legend, I don't think the raid on Onigashima is successful for a variety of reasons, but
Yeah.
like his death ultimately led to the liberation. It was like the seed that led to the liberation of Wano. And yeah.
Absolutely. And I think if not for that flashback, Wano as an arc would not have worked as well. I know
Yeah.
there's some people would argue that it still doesn't work, but I think that flashback is really what encapsulates everything that makes Wano so great. And what makes the raid so great, it's not just um, that moment and everything around Odin's adventure and who he was as a person. It's also everything that that happened afterwards. Everything where Kinemon and Momonosuke and the Scabbards, what they endured on the way to get back to Wano, what the Scabbards who stayed behind endured during those 20 years. And when we think about what the Void Century flashback might entail, I think there's going to be a very similar framing of those characters and those ideas, because it's also going to be a similar conflict that has been built up over a long period of time. We're going to have another character like Odin, which is obviously going to be Joy Boy,
Hmm.
and we're going to see how his final moments and his sacrifice are what led to the success that is going to happen now. We've already seen a little bit in Egghead with Emmett, but we're going to see something even bigger for sure. And I think that that Void Century flashback, we'll probably, after seeing that, we'll probably come back to the Odin flashback and look at that with a whole new perspective, especially the portions with Roger.
So I was thinking about what you're talking about with the Void Century flashback, because we talked earlier about like flashback in One Piece doesn't normally just kind of like slide in there and you're just in it for because the story wants it. It's usually because there's this like tense moment where a character is like literally recalling the past or something, right? Or that's the implication. And so with a Void Century flashback, there's a couple interesting vectors that this can go through, right? Because who knows who is alive or could possibly tell us what happened during the Void Century? There's Emeth on an Egghead, but obviously that doesn't. It's not like they're like gonna sit down for a tea party.
Yeah.
Before it's too late. But the next vectors are like through Vivi with Nefertari Lily. Like if somehow she comes across like Lily's story.
Yeah.
Kind of depends on what Vivi ends up doing. And then whenever Emu gets more directly ingrained in the story, when Emu sees Luffy, right? Like, and is, maybe feeling that hockey again or anything like that. Like, Emu could be the one that sends us into a Void Century flashback. And that'd be very interesting as well, depending on what that relationship was with Lily and Joy Boy.
Yeah, 100%. Shade says that Rob Lucci's flashback is an underrated one, in his opinion. How do you feel about Rob Lucci?
Well, Rob Lucci's flashback, it is underrated, and it's interesting, right? Because at least what I remember is he like ends up murdering like the captain and all the hostages as well.
Yeah, it's like 100 people.
Yeah, and it's just like ruthless, and so it really kind of informs the type of character that Lucci is that he's very like how would I say, he's like, you shouldn't have been captured, right? Like you were too weak. So he sees the way that he understands power is very black and white, but it also like really informs why he's chosen his like allegiances. It's informed me of why he had an opportunity to kind of become good, but he still sees like he still sees the world government as like the strong and the powerful in compared to the pirates, and so he's like, I'm going to be on that side because like this is with the strong and I want to be strong because it's the strong that deserve to live. That's at least how I see his flashback, but I haven't read it in a while, to be fair.
Yeah. By the way, I think my neighbor heard that we were streaming again, so he decided to start mowing his lawn. But I just want to add about Rob Lucci. I think what his flashback also tells us is that he's somebody that uses justice, the world government, that symbol, as just as an excuse to be a horrible person. Like he was already that like malicious person, and he just is a part of the world government because it allows him to be that person.
Yeah.
But I did want to bring it back to the previous arc, which is, I think now, becoming more appreciated within the community. But this is one of my personal favorite flashbacks, and I think you would agree based on what you've told me about Skypiea, and that is Nolan and Kalgara. But with Nolan and Kalgara, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time we get a flashback in One Piece that's not about the Straw Hats or a character that's associated with them. Um, so this is a flashback that sort of changes the game, I think, when you're first getting into One Piece, because you're like, oh, we can get these bigger, deeper stories, but for characters that we don't even know. And like Odin's, the Nolan flashback is one that sort of hints at bigger things within the world and the lore, and obviously the Void Century. I mean, this is the arc that everyone goes back to talk about the foreshadowing for Joy Boy and all those sort of themes of liberation. But so basically what I'm trying to say is that for all the same reasons that the Odin flashback is great, so too is the Nolan flashback. I think that beyond that, though, Nolan and Kalgra's relationship and the forming of their relationship is the heart of that flashback. So even without the bigger lore connections, it really holds up on its own.
Yeah, I feel like that flashback is like the essence of One Piece.
Yeah, you have, well, obviously you have the inherited will, which these two are sort of, they are the origin of everything that's going on in Skypiea, with the Shandians and with Mont Blanc Cricket. I think, yeah, that was his name. But also we have the deeply emotional storytelling of their bond. We have both of their desires for freedom in a sense. For Kalgra, I would say that it's his freedom to him, I think, is something more smaller and just wanting to be able to protect his people and wants the Shandian tribe to be able to thrive. For Nolan, he is more traditional in the sense of wanting that adventure and wanting that connection. But then you have the, what would you call it, the muddied water of labels that you see so often in One Piece. You have the Shandian tribe who are like very very resistant to outsiders and outside ideology. They have very clear definitions of who they think they're supposed to be. But then you have Nolan representing the outsiders, and through their bond, they're able to break down those walls and show the humanity within both sides. And it also shows how both of the symbols, I guess, if you will, that they follow, like with Kalgra, it would be like their worshipping of the gods and their overall tribe and their culture. And with Nolan, it's I forget the name of his kingdom, but it would just be that monarchy that he's a part of. But it shows how the individuals within those systems, if you will, are more nuanced than the systems themselves. And overall, it's just really, really beautiful storytelling. Whenever people say that like Skypiea is a bad arc, I think back to that flashback and I'm like, this is just this flashback and everything that builds up to it, everything that it pays off, every little nuance within their dialogue, everything about it is just the pinnacle, the embodiment of beautiful storytelling. And I'm just like, how can Skypiea be a bad arc with something like that so deeply woven into its narrative?
Yeah, I got my Skypiea video cooking and stuff. My wife and I reread it recently, and I was literally just lured by the like raw power of that flashback and how it perfectly ties together everything in Skypiea, but it also ties together so many things that happen later in One Piece. Like Skypiea, in a way, is like, I think, looked down on in a way because it comes in early into the story, where a lot of the stuff that comes later enhances all that stuff. but in terms of like the ordering of the stories, Skypiea is actually kind of laying that foundation. For example, the kind of crux and purpose of the flashback is to show this promise between Noland and Calgera, and how Luffy is fulfilling that promise that they've waited for generations. But then we also have things like Binks Brew, which is, a famous pirate song that's basically about a promise to deliver this brew. And then, without going into spoilers for anime onlys, the Harley text and mural that we get is essentially also about this promise. And then that, these two things will meet again one day. And then we get the Fishman Island, where Joy Boy has to apologize, written on a poneglyph, to Fishman Island and to Poseidon for a promise that he wasn't able to get or complete, meaning that somebody is going to fulfill this promise one day. And so all of that is kind of like enhanced with the foundation that Skypiea left us with. And for anybody that's like, I don't like Skypiea, like, go back and read it. Don't watch the anime. I don't know why. I just think the manga version is a lot better.
It 100% is. The anime has it has its strengths for sure in there in the Skypiea arc, but it drags heavily, especially in the middle part.
Yeah, because like on my reread at least, I did not find Skypiea to be much of a drag at all. And if you're reading relatively closely, which I challenge you to do if you reread it, like try to like really see all these connections that you have from the later arcs that are woven into Skypiea. And especially with, when we get to Skypiea, we don't have any information about Emu or really the Celestial Dragons in general. But all of these kind of like ideas and power structures are integrated already into Skypiea. And like once you know about what the world government is, what the Celestial Dragons are, and where Emu is within that hierarchy, and kind of like what pirates represent in this system, I think Skypiea is just like this really beautiful encapsulation of what the world is down on the Blue Sea.
Yeah, 100%. It's the flashback that just keeps on giving, but even without all those things, I think it's just very well executed. Even if One Piece were to end at like around after Skypiea when it initially was supposed to, I think that would still just be one of the most memorable things I'd ever read or watched.
Yeah, for sure.
But do you want to bring us into the next flashback that you were thinking about?
Yeah, I'll head into Law. Now Law, he's my... I always liked Law. He was like this little kind of like edgy bad boy that we meet in Sabaody. And his actions when we run into him in Punk Hazard, his actions in Marineford are bewildering and weird, right? Like he just shows up kind of and helps Luffy with no particular benefit to himself. He teams up with the Straw Hats. And at this point he's on a path of self-destruction, of revenge. But there's like a deeper motivation running through everything, and we know that because of how he showed up at the end of the war to save Luffy and whoever else he could. But when he fails to defeat Doflamingo himself, he recalls his past, and and you see Law is just that what the world had done to him just made him a hateful, like he literally just wants to like kill everybody and make everybody feel the pain that he's felt, because it just makes him so angry and upset. And none of that really changes until he's on a path of annihilation of himself, and he's like, I'm gonna attack the captain's brother. He's gonna attack Corazon, and that will get me killed or whatever, right? Like, he was explicitly told that is like the main no, and he does it anyways, and he's expecting to be punished, but it never comes because Corazon has been kind of silently watching Law and sees this this suffering that just like permeates his character. And because of the stories that Corazon heard about members of the D, he becomes even more interested in Law when he overhears Law's true name. And Law is still just like a broken character at this point, but they go on. He basically kidnaps Law and takes him on a journey around the world looking for this cure, right? And it does not benefit. It really doesn't benefit his stated mission, because I don't think that mission was ultimately a path of revenge. It's kind of like a reflection of what Law wanted as well. But it becomes pretty obvious that that's not really what Rocinante wanted. And we see Rocinante really find a meaningful purpose of his life. He kind of slowly steers away from the revenge that was, going to annihilate him and give him a purposeless death. And he eventually learns to kind of sincerely love Law as a person for the first time that Law has felt since he lost his entire family. And obviously that's incredibly beautiful and well done. I remember a moment that really sticks out to me during this period is when Rocinante believes Law is like asleep when they're camping, and they're just like futilely struggling, looking for a doctor that will even try to help Law. And Rocinante says that even though Law stabbed him that day, he knew it was only that it was Law who was truly in pain and suffering.
Yeah, that's my favorite moment in the flashback. I love that.
Yeah,
scene.
it's just so beautifully done. And Law, of course, wasn't asleep and is hearing this, and that just changes Law, and you just see why Law is who he is, that because of this. And then eventually they get a lead on the op fruit, and the whole thing kind of like breaks down to where they're screwed, but Rocinante bravely confronts his own death, right? He knows it's over, but he wants to like die doing something meaningful. And so he sets Law in a chest, and for the first time in who knows how long, he just goes like, "I love you, Law," and that's it. And Law is ultimately saved from that moment. But like the other thing that sticks out from me is like Rocinante declaring that Law is free. He's freed from this cage, and then obviously we cut forward into Doflamingo literally putting a cage around Dressrosa, and then Law is again in a cage, and then it's Luffy that breaks him out. And so there's that very like kind of beautiful connection to what makes Luffy so special, and what makes Luffy specifically special to Law as well, and becomes this kind of motivation for Law, because it's not like stated super clearly like many times over, but Law's motivation in life right now is seeking out the meaning of D, right? That's he wants to learn about the true history, basically. Yeah. And Um, I think that Luffy's connection in all of this is part of what has motivated him to feel that connection with Luffy. That he sees part of Rosinante and Corazon in Luffy as well, and that kind of like journey of liberation.
Yeah, I one of my favorite things about Law's flashback is that relationship between him and Corazon, and just how Oda communicates the power of unconditional love, how it can change Law. I think in a lot of Dressrosa, there's this exploration of nature versus nurture, and especially so with Doflamingo and Corazon. But
Hmm.
you see how very easily Law could have become somebody like Doflamingo.
Oh yeah,
Doflamingo in another world could have made Law his apprentice or whatever. But it's because Corazon was the one to intervene and show him show him the light within the darkness, that Law became somebody else, and that he ended up becoming somebody uh, who could do something like what Corazon did for him, but do it for Luffy and Marineford. I think that's what motivated him to save Luffy, at least
yeah.
uh, subconsciously, if nothing else.
Yeah, so I found that story to be so beautiful, and every time I reread it, which it's one of my favorites to reread, um, I always continually find like those massive themes of One Piece are just like so powerfully expressed in that flashback. It has a lot of flashbacks, but the kind of big brother or almost parental relationship and the unconditional love I find to be especially powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And my next flashback I want to bring up, I'm actually gonna, for the sake of time, talk about two of them. But real quick, I want to talk about Robin's. I think Robin's does have a lot of similarities to Law, but also Sanji's flashback. You could also
Mhm.
say maybe Nami's, but with Law, I think that they were, out of all the characters, they're probably the two that have gone through some of the most horrific things that a child could at their age. But because they found the right people at the right time, they were able to uh, ultimately end up going down a different path. Um, what makes Robin's flashback so special to me is, I think, as like what we were talking about earlier with like the timing and the moments of when the author tries to decides to show a flashback. That to me, Robin's flashback, I think, is the pinnacle of that for me, because
Yeah,
he spent so long building up this character from Alabasta to that point, that when we get to that moment, where we finally learn about who she is and why she's doing all these things and what has actually been going on inside her head for so long, it's just so cathartic. And then to have her "I want to live" moment right after that is perfect. Um, Robin's character and her flashback is really unique in that way, because Oda was really playing the long game there, especially when you consider the real world time that passed, as he was, building up for that. Um, that to me, I think if I had not already decided that One Piece was my favorite story, at that point is when I did, because it just showed me how worth it was to just have patience in Oda's writing.
yeah, I
Um,
agree that that is probably like the best like timed flashback. Like it just is perfectly laid into the story at the perfect time, leading to the perfect expression in the present moment in
yeah,
the story.
and
Um,
I just want to say to Shade's comment about, I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people have said that after, for to keep it spoiler free, but after a certain chapter in the current arc, the that Robin's flashback is kind of devalued or has lost a lot of weight. I completely disagree with that. I think that um, I think that her flashback still stands on its own, and I think it's honestly been made even better by what has happened. So I'm really glad with how Oda's handled Robin's character within that flashback, and how he continues to handle her character. And similarly to Law, I think he does touch upon that depression that both Law and Robin felt, that despair. That I think is that level of despair. I think is unique to those two, and I think he handles that very, very well. And I think it's one of the reasons why he pairs the two together a lot, because they kind of instinctively just get each other. They're kind of on the same wavelength in a lot of ways. But yeah, I love Robin's flashback. I don't think much needs to be said on there because everyone kind of agrees with that. But the next flashback I want to talk about is a little bit more controversial, I think. And that is the Fishman Island flashback, which is, for a lot of the reasons why I like Skypiea, I also like the Fishman Island flashback. It's heavy on the lore. It does a lot of world building for that story, but also everything within One Piece as a whole. It goes back to those themes of the sun representing the dawn, and all those very important establishing concepts that would then be expanded on as post-time skip developed. But the one reason why I love Fishman Island so much is because it completely recontextualizes not just Otohime and Fisher Tiger, but all of the fishmen and everything that we've experienced in relation to the fishmen. So Arlong Park, Hachan in Sabaody, the Celestial Dragons as a whole, and all of these sort of more broader, complex issues within the One Piece world.
Yeah, I found the Fishman Island flashback, like you said, it's like a beautifully pairing with Skypiea's flashback. But I also, like Fisher Tiger, he's one of my favorite characters, and seeing his kind of like greatness as a leader being kind of brought down by this like inherited like hatred that he grew up with, and that he like had instilled with him by being forced into slavery, and like that suffering of not being able to let go of his hatred, and how that ultimately causes his destruction, is so like informative. Because as much as One Piece is a story about love, like you also have to explore the opposite of that, right? Like what does hatred do to somebody? We know how love like liberates people. We've seen that so many times in One Piece, but the way that hatred destroys people was a very interesting exploration, especially with a character that could have been a contender to be Joy Boy, possibly, right? That's kind of what I would argue. And then I'm sure you want to talk about Otohime a little bit too, but like another fascinating character.
Yeah, that's beautifully said about Fisher Tiger. And like we were saying earlier, despite how flawed or upsetting his ultimate choice may be, you understand why, right? You understand why he makes that choice, why he's so overwhelmed with hatred. And I think it is ultimately that extreme display of that causes Jinbei to change, because I think a lot of people don't give that flashback enough credit for how it informs us of Jinbei's character, and how he at one point could have easily ended up being somebody similar to Arlong. He and Arlong were two of the most violent people on his crew towards humans, but Jinbei becomes a much more peaceful character who's willing to have faith in the goodness of the future. Ultimately, there's a lot of emphasis on having faith in the future in Fishman Island,
Yep.
and not getting stuck in the past. And to just briefly touch on Otohime, she is somebody who understood that from the very beginning, and that's why the flashback pretty much opens up with her, why she is kind of the driving force of that flashback, because all the other characters in the flashback are sort of reacting and frequently responding to her enthusiastic desire for just peace between humans and fishmen. And even Fisher Tiger, we see, struggles to align himself with that. But ultimately, the journey that they go on, Jinbei and the Fisherman Pirates, it leads them to the same conclusion that Otohime already came to. And I think that's what makes the flashback so special, with how it interlocks all of those characters' ideologies and stories within that one central story. And then some other little stuff to just throw in there is, I think it's really cool how this flashback gets paid off later on with Mjosgard in the Reverie. That to me was one of the most unexpected things, is seeing him show up again. That was so surprising to me, but it felt authentic because of what we saw in that flashback.
Yeah, I feel like Otohime's everything, her death especially, and how she died and how she lived leading up to her death. Like, she really executed on like what she wanted to deliver to the people of Fishman Island. And without her life, basically, it would have been really hard, I think, for Fishman to accept the Straw Hats at all. But even though they've kind of like fallen from the path that she set forward all that time ago, like, that memory still like was affecting many of the people in Fishman Island, and the ideology of Hody Jones was kind of like this poison to what Otohime was trying to set up. He was ultimately attempting to instill the inherited hatred, even though he himself had no particular reason to hate. He still wanted to instill that message. And so Luffy and them came in at like the perfect time to remind everybody of Otohime's message and stuff. And I think that's a big part of the reason why they were accepted, is because Otohime's message lived on, especially through Shirahoshi. Like, thankfully Shirahoshi came out of her little tower or whatever for that. But yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the handling of all the complex themes and the multiple characters, and then how it kind of propels us forward. I think there's a lot of progression that is unique to that flashback, because it does sort of give us the sense that the entire situation with the Fishmen is kind of moving forward, which is such a broader scope than some of the other flashbacks. So all that stuff together just makes the flashback very special to me. And Oda handled it surprisingly really well, not to doubt his writing, but it's not very easy to handle topics like that from all those different angles, and to do it in such a tasteful and realistic way.
Definitely.
But yeah, do you want to take us into your next flashback?
Yeah, and I can pair them together too, because I've actually thought a lot about how Nami's flashback and Bonnie's flashback, or Kuma's flashback, they feel like they're kind of in the same vein, right? Because Kuma's flashback is incredibly painful, but also incredibly like affirming about what it means to live, which is to live is to suffer to a degree, right? Like, I literally don't know a single person in my actual life that hasn't suffered.
Yeah.
And so that's part of, and like all the characters that we have in One Piece, like each of the Straw Hats, we get a flashback of them having some kind of suffering in their life.
Yeah.
And Kuma is one of the most horrible and painful and evil and sadistic, and it just kind of never fully stops, right? And the message that you end up getting, I don't want to spoil it too much for people that are anime only that might watch this, but like the fact that Kuma keeps getting back up and keeps moving forward, it's just so beautiful because he believes in a better life. He believes in a liberation for all people. He believes in the liberation for his daughter. And we already know, anime onlys already know, that Kuma has completely lost his humanity by being turned into a weapon. But the reason for doing so is very meaningful to Kuma. And so he like fully accepts a death as long as it has purpose in it, and he takes that death as we would all expect with a smile, right? Yep. And seeing him smile at the end of his life, that was so just like so much pain in it, and then also feeling the love that he felt in his life and the fact that he still decides to give it up to let somebody else be free and experience their own life that will inevitably have suffering and love in it as well. It's just a perfect encapsulation. And then we have Nami's flashback, where she is adopted in some type of genocide or war situation. Bellamere is just like some random Navy soldier is like picks up a baby who's has this horrible shit happening all around her, and yet she's smiling and laughing and she's not feeling any of that like pain and horror that's happening around her. And that ability to laugh and smile and stuff despite all this suffering around them was very like life affirming for Bellamere. And so then Bellamere adopts them and decides to become a parent. And as somebody that is an actual parent to two little kids, like, you know, being a parent is tough and stuff, but I mean, it's also a very like meaningful experience. And when Bellamere comes up to the situation where she can deny her own children and let them sail off into what would obviously be a guaranteed death, despite like being like, oh, maybe they'll somehow live. You know, you have to assume that that's what the kids are told. They're like, go out and sail, you'll be okay, we're gonna lie, and like everybody will get to live. And Bellamere says, fuck that. No thank you. I love these girls, and I don't want them to go out to sea and die thinking that I didn't actually love them.
Yeah.
And so she despite everything, she's like, I'm going to give up my life right now, accept my death, so that I can make sure that my love will like exist in these kids forever. And I found that like unconditional love that Bellamere has for Nami and Nojiko is very much in line with the death that Kuma accepts in his story. And I find them both to complement each other very well. And even the last time I reread that flashback was I did a video involving it, but like when I really kind of reread the whole Arlong Park arc was when my wife was reading One Piece for the first time, so a couple years ago, basically at this point. And like revisiting that flashback, I still was just like, it just brought me to tears with everything that was going on in my life. With I had a young kid at the time. My wife was pregnant with our second kid, and that just like parental bond and love that you see in that arc is very powerful.
Yeah, and I think what makes it so much more powerful is the complicated relationship that her daughters have with her, especially Nami. And we see the origins of where Nami, of her feelings of being a burden, basically.
Yeah.
Of her feeling like she's just this burden on her mother and not somebody that she willingly wants to take care of and suffer in order to take care of her. And so Bellemere doing that, like they have that fight right before, but Bellemere doing that just really affirms to Nami how much she loved her. But even then, it's not enough because that stuff was like deeply ingrained with her as a child, and that traumatic experience only made the stress so much worse. Which again, I feel like we come back to this a lot, but in the present, we have Luffy reaffirming the same feelings for her, which allows her to, in a sense, fully be liberated. But also like how Nami has to get to that point herself. Luffy refuses to help her until she actually asks for help. So she has to really get pushed to that point again. But if not for Bellemere's sacrifice, if not for her commitment to confirming how much she cared about her, then she never would have gotten to that point in the first place. And you could say the same thing about Kuma in certain aspects. There's a lot more we could talk about with Kuma's flashback. There's so many areas that it covers in terms of themes and other things that happen in the story, but since the flashback has just started in the anime, I think it's best to leave that stuff unsaid for now. But finally, I do want to bring this back to another flashback that's similar to Kuma's in how it covers a lot of ground, and that is the ASL flashback, which I don't know where this would rank for me, but it's 100% top 3. I love this flashback to death. It's one of my favorite sections in the story. I think for one, it does come in at a great time, like some of the other flashbacks we mentioned. Some people say it would have been maybe more effective before Marineford. I think it works well. It could work well either way. I think it works better coming after, partly because it is like a reprieve from all the intensity that was Marineford, but also because I think it just makes all of the character stuff with young Luffy and Ace and Sabo hit a lot harder when you know the context of what happens in Marineford. I also feel like at this point in the story, for me, is where Luffy really just became one of the greatest characters of all time. I actually really did not like Luffy for a long time when I first started, and I know a lot of other people struggle to really get into his character. He's kind of a hard character to get into in certain contexts, and it's one of the reasons why the live action I think was so good, because it's such a hard character to bring into that type of medium. But this, at that point after the saga where it's entirely following Luffy, to then finish that off with going back to his childhood yet again, but also exploring Ace's childhood and Sabo, and of course this flashback also has, in my opinion, the best mom in One Piece, Dodon, and I think you would agree. Dodon is such a good character, and I don't know what it is exactly about this flashback, but I think, one, I like the fact that it's really long. I like flashbacks that are a little bit longer. I like the fact that it really fleshed out Luffy's character even further and allowed me to better appreciate who he is in the present and why he is the way that he is, and how who he was as a child influenced Ace, and how who Ace was influenced Luffy, and how they both helped each other without really knowing it at the time. And I like the stuff with Sabo too. I think some of Sabo's better stuff comes later, but his character writing was great, of course, and everything with those three characters' bond, I think, is what really makes it. Their bond of just wanting freedom and what that meant to each of them. How despite all their different characters and despite their different their pasts, they all had that striving for more. They just wanted more out of life, and there's just something very romantic about that in a narrative sense, and that's, to me, it just captures so much of what One Piece is about, and it's why I loved how we came back to that in episode 10-15. That's one of the highlights of that episode, and it's just a really great creative choice, because that bond between them is really just the heart of the story for me. So I love the character writing with those three. I love Dodon. I love the more slice of life kind of vibe that's there. We don't always get that in One Piece for that extended period of time, which was nice. And I like how it then beautifully sets up Luffy's resolution with Jinbei right after. So just the emotional storytelling, both within the flashback, with everything that came before and then everything that came after. Kind of a lot of the stuff we've already been saying, but I love those characters that are involved. So that one's very special to me.
And I'll take it a tiny little step further on pushing of what makes this flashback so special, because you're right, it does capture kind of what makes One Piece so special generally too, like in the kind of like tone and emotional expression, and it really hits like what makes Luffy such like a special character. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that Ace especially is in like an immense amount of pain by who he is, and being constantly told that he shouldn't have been born at all. You know, he talks to Garp about would it just be better if I wasn't born at all?
Yeah.
And you know, like in my view of what it means to be, of what humanity is, it's like, especially with you know, the power structures in the world, and which also kind of like show up in One Piece, obviously. People are deeply alienated, right? People seek genuine, meaningful connections, but it's very difficult. The structures of our worlds, or the structures in One Piece, their goal is to alienate people. There's propaganda about who Ace is that it ultimately serves to alienate Ace and pirates. The islands in One Piece serve as mechanisms of alienation where you can't go anywhere if you're like any type of regular person.
The red line too. It's just
the red line literally
separation.
divides the world, and you know, unless you're one of the baddest dudes around, you're not getting under it. And certainly you're not allowed to go over it. And for the people that do go over it, you're either a pirate or you're a dog of the military or something like that, and so you're giving up some of your freedom. So Ace he feels that alienation so powerfully, right? So much so that he's not sure if he should have been born at all. And then there's that very powerful moment in the flashback, which I know you're a big fan of, where Luffy's like, tells him that he needs him.
Yeah, that's
and that he's happy that he was born. And Ace's reaction to that is just like, he's basically like, can you say that again? Because it felt kind of good. And that is who Luffy is in
Yeah.
a nutshell. That he genuinely loves people and seeks connection, and he and that he's not afraid to show it. He doesn't want to be alone, so he'll do anything to not lose somebody. And that is who Luffy is. And then um, Sabo is somebody that he's not suffering in the same sense that Ace is, but he has expectations within society that he has to meet. That he's told he has to meet, and he, you know, decides to kind of live a lie and pretend to be like a little dumpster kid when he's actually very wealthy, but he's ashamed of that side of himself, right? Um, and I think that's like a pretty. It's a little bit less explored than I kind of maybe would ideally look for, and Sabo is probably coming into the story quite a bit more down the road, so we might learn some more. But
Mhm.
it's a very interesting position within society. But it does show that even if you're higher up in this hierarchy, like Sabo is, like he's a wealthy kid, and
Mhm.
he could have just done nothing and kind of just coasted, but it wouldn't be a meaningful life because all those things that people have in that class structure, they're illusions, right?
Mhm.
They're it's like Big Mom just chowing down candy because she can't deal with people being honest with her, or she knows that nobody actually loves her,
Mhm.
so she just eats candy all the time. um these people in Sabo's area, they just surround themselves with things, nice things, and kind of pretend like they deserve it. Um, and Sabo understands that that's not real, and he wants to go out and see the world, get closer to the truth of what it means to live, so that he can actually um, have a meaningful life.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's Sabo having Sabo as a character in there is so what's such an interesting choice to give us that perspective of the noble. I do really appreciate when Oda goes out of his way to sort of offer those more limited perspectives within One Piece of those
Mhm.
those other sides, and we also see how there's like a hierarchy to the prejudice within the One Piece world. It's not just the celestial dragons at the top. It goes all the way down to smaller villages like that who are more so just striving after the model that the celestial dragons present, and they just are just trying to get ahead in that life, and they only really care about themselves. And just seeing the depravity of that, of how they're willing to burn down the entire gray terminal. Uh,
Oh yeah.
yeah, and there's just a lot of really, really elegant explorations of that sort of thing in this flashback, on top of Ace, Luffy, and Sabo, who they're very innocent, childlike
Mm,
bond and desire for freedom. That I think is key to this flashback because of how innocent it is. It's that sort of that baseline desire for freedom that is One Piece to me.
yep.
And because they're all so young, it One Piece is. I don't know if you've ever seen Gurren Lagann, um, but One Piece kind of looks at dreams in a similar way of how dreams and just like believing in yourself can be like really childish and naive in a sense, but despite that, it's still worth believing in and still worth doing those things. And you get that communicated in this flashback uh, very strongly, and even more so with how painful it is in context in relation to Marineford and Ace's death, of course. So yeah, I think that flashback is really really important to the story, but also just very beautiful character writing.
So good.
Yeah. But that is pretty much everything I wanted to get into. Obviously, there's a lot more we could talk about with One Piece and flashbacks, of course. But
It'd be an
unfortunately,
8-hour stream.
it would be an 8-hour stream, yeah. So unfortunately, we do got to start wrapping up. Um, it basically the underlying points that we've come to is that a good flashback is one that comes at the right time in the story, usually uh, as a relief from tension in order to sort of redirect where the story is going and the audience's relation to the story. Also, it recontextualizes the characters and the story itself if done well. And it usually, I think, just to put it simply, it has something to say about the characters, about the themes. It's not just there to be there. It's not just there to slow things down or give an arbitrary look into the character's childhood. There's something to be said usually, and One Piece does that very frequently. Oda does have his own handful of weaknesses as a writer, but I think he really has just nailed it down when it comes to flashbacks and that sort of like very intentional character writing. And of course, we've already touched upon the ones that we enjoy the most, but you could take any other handful of flashbacks in the story and they would be just as powerful, I think, and there'd be just as much to talk about, as we've said. But with that, we're gonna wrap this up. Is there any other upcoming videos or stuff you want to plug besides your channel?
Oh, well, if you haven't seen any of my videos, just go to my channel and watch any of my more recent ones, especially. I think are all pretty solid. And then upcoming, the next video is going to be a kind of like arc discussion, review, analysis that I did with my wife about Jaya and Skypiea. I have no idea. I mean, the full recording of that is like 3 hours long. Cutting that up into what I want it to be is going to be interesting. And then following that, I have a video about the horrifying, like painful life of Big Mom and like the toxic family dynamics of the Big Mom pirates. And then after that, it's going to be a video about Zoro's kind of journey of mastering the sword and all that. So
Interesting.
that's kind of what's on my horizon.
Awesome. I mean, that all sounds really cool. And like he said, be sure to check out his channel and some of his past videos, especially some of the recent ones, because there's some good stuff there. But thank you all for tuning in and being a part of this discussion and listening to us for these past 2 hours almost. Appreciate your support as always. I've got a new video coming out this week, and you can look out for more streams as well. But that's all for now. Hopefully we'll see you guys in the next one.